gonna put my foot on the floor and I'm not lifting till I see God or a checkered flag.
Hello, and welcome back to season 2 of Racing Thoughts, an IndyCar podcast. I'm Megan Dennis,
And I'm Meg Taylor.
and as we're waiting for the start of racing in St. Pete in the coming weeks, we're going to be doing something a little bit interesting, I think, something to kind of really get us into what is the kind of the world of IndyCar. If you don't know, if you're new to the sport, if you're wanting to get into it for the first time, or if you have been around but you don't really know a lot about whether it's the history of the sport, whether it's the techs and specs and regs, or whether it's the grid as it's going into this new season, we're going to be covering all of that. Starting off today, by no means is this going to be in depth, but today I'm going to be covering kind of a history of IndyCar, really going it through what has it looked like since we started off in 1905 all the way now. Here we are in 2025, which is wild to say. But yeah, just really what has changed over the last 120 years of being a sport of IndyCar. This is something I didn't necessarily know a lot about until now, and the teacher in me could not help it. I have made to be able to show Meg.
I'm obsessed with this. I love PowerPoints, okay?
But yeah, unfortunately we are an audio only broadcast, but for at least my co-host, there's a lovely PowerPoint to help me stay on track.
No, I'm saying, do you think we could publish this? Because this is amazing.
You say this, you haven't seen it yet. We can decide after.
I don't care whether or not I've seen it. I want this published. This is amazing. Listen, I'm ready for this. I've got my snacks. I've got water. I've got my blanket. I am ready for the lore, okay?
All right, so with that said, we're going to try to use this PowerPoint to keep me on track. It doesn't work in my own classroom, but anyways, IndyCar 1905 through present day. Starting out with a timeline of it, really, we can break this down into we have had kind of 5 main eras of IndyCar. So going through all of them from here, start off era 1, we have the American Automobile Association, or AAA. This lasted from 1909. So yes, we did really start as the first race in 1905. We're really starting in 1909 through 1955 with our first governing body. So with this kind of predating that 1909 AAA era, 1905 season was the first season of IndyCar open wheel racing in America. Not really a ton of notes on that one, but just kind of that idea that that is why 1905 is the starting date. We have the first race happening from there. With this though, really as a series, we can kind of date it back to the American Automobile Association, AAA, 1909 with its first season. So first kind of governing body to take place. With this, the first race was held in Portland, Oregon on June 12th, 1909. It consisted of 6 cars, 3 laps, and lasted 47 minutes. So that really just kind of gives you an idea of how slow these cars were, or potentially how large the track is. History is a little unclear from that day, but probably a combination of both. Interestingly, with this, we had 23 races in 1909, so a lot more than we're running currently. This consisted of street races and road races, so similarly to what we see now. Along that, we also had dirt tracks, which were kind of the precursor to what we would now consider our modern day oval races. With this, too, IndyCar looked a lot different in 1909, where the final race was an endurance race going from LA to Phoenix. A guy by the name of George Robertson was the first IndyCar champion. With this, for Meg, who can see it, IndyCar is in quotation marks because it's open wheel racing in America. Most open wheel racing series in America would fall under this IndyCar umbrella, but clearly not IndyCar even remotely close to what we know and think of today. Yeah, the name that we know and love, the race that is the icon of the sport, the greatest spectacle in motor racing, the Indy 500. So the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, IMS, opened in 1909. With this, the first Indy 500 was held May 30th, 1911. So only consistent race that was held during kind of this time, though, was this Indy 500. So it's been going on for years due to both World Wars. Most of the other races that could have taken place at this time were not occurring. On top of this, in 1946, so following the end of the Second World War, the Indy 500 marked the first race that was ran in motorsport. A guy by the name of George Robson, not to be confused with George Robertson, who was the first IndyCar champion, won the race. However, a guy by the name of Ted Horn won the 1946 championship. He also won the 1947 and 1948 championships, but was killed in an accident on track in 1940. Why do I mention this? It's because the death of Ted Horn, along with a few other incidences, including the Le Mans big kind of crash in 1955 that led to 82 fans dying, led to AAA saying we don't want to be responsible for open wheel racing. We don't want to be that sanctioning body just because at that point safety was too high a risk. During this time, it's probably the biggest number of IndyCar drivers were killed on track. I want to say that it was around 36 drivers were killed in accidents, almost nearly all of them happening at the speedway. So, understandably, AAA said, we don't want that blood on our hands anymore. We're going to step away. This, of course, people still wanted to race, people still wanted it, and they know that we need someone who's in charge of running all of that. So this led to in 1956, the founding of the United States Auto Club to take over as leadership. So leads us into our second era that we can really think of IndyCar and open wheel motorsport in the U.S. with the United States Auto Club, USAC, which lasted from 1956 until 1979. First season in 1956, we really saw the rise of the first paved ovals. Something I found really interesting, why I made a point to put all of them up here, is because all three of these tracks we still race on today. Not necessarily IndyCar, but all three of them are still actively used in modern motorsport. So with that, you of course have IMS with the Indy 500 being ran and the Indy Road Course there. You have Milwaukee, both IndyCar and NASCAR races the Milwaukee Mile. As of this past year, we've seen the return of IndyCar there. And then Darlington, which is not currently used for IndyCar and probably will never, just for a matter of safety, at least at current, we'll probably never see us go back to Darlington. But NASCAR actively ends their season there every year. So something I think is really cool that as of 1956, the three first paved ovals are still ones that we're seeing used here in modern day. With this too, we also saw 12 dirt tracks being used, all of which would then become paved oval tracks over the next 15 years. So really seeing a bigger focus on safety and recognizing that if we're wanting to go this fast, we need to make sure it can be done kind of in a more secure way. All right, during this time, we saw two very big notable names that are still kind of big names in the sport. Throughout this, I'm going to mention several different names and people. Is this to say for any IndyCar historians or anyone who's very big into like the history of it or knows more about like previous drivers that these are the only big names that raced during this time? No. I'm mentioning this because these are still names that you are going to hear very actively in today's IndyCar. So if you are getting into the season in 2025 and you are wanting to really be part of it, well, these are guys who have been around for a long time. These are historical names that you are still going to hear and every once in a while even see at races and stuff. So with that, into this USCA kind of period, we had the rise of AJ Foyt. AJ Foyt's rookie season was in 1957. With this, he has won 7 championships. So he's the most in IndyCar history with this one. He also has 4 Indy 500 wins, which ties the record. He's one of several drivers that have won 4. No one has ever won more than that repeatedly. And also in 1967, he won the Indy 500 and Le Mans, being the first driver to ever successfully win 2 parts of the Triple Crown within the same year. Of course, he's also the name of AJ Foyt Racing. He owns the team. Mr. Foyt is well up close to 90 these days, but very much still there when he can be. Definitely sponsors the team. Very much is a big supporter and cares immensely about IndyCar. So kind of cool to see that he's been involved for so long. Next to that, arguably what could potentially be one of the biggest names in all of motorsport, I'll go on a limb to say probably one of the most recognizable regardless of disciplines, is Mario Andretti. So Mario Andretti, rookie season was in 1964. Of course, he is part of the legendary racing family that is the Andrettis. He's won 5 championships. He was the first driver to win the IndyCar championship and the F1 championship. Others have also gone on to do it. Emerson Fittipaldi, Nigel Mansell, but of course the first was Mario Andretti. Man's still around. Man still enjoys what he's doing. He loves motorsport in all forms. He's a legend in the sport for a reason. So notable names because the Andretti team's still part of the IndyCar series. Mario still very happily drives people around in the 2-seater IndyCar for races just because he loves it so much. If they would let him still race, I think he would still do it very happily. Notable names of this era. With this, cars, you can see in the picture, are looking more similar to kind of what we know now. So with this, 1964, Lotus Ford was the first car to ever win having a rear engine. And with that was with Nellie Jones, the Milwaukee Mile. With this, we saw what was known as turbocharged era from 1970 to 1997 kind of be introduced during this time. So engines were a lot bigger, cars were a lot faster, things were a lot louder. You had that downforce. There was a lot of fast, loud racing. Again, started to look a lot more like what we know and love to be of the sport today. With this, 70s kind of had an interesting period between 71 and 76 where it was only paved oval racing. So that's not something we see at all in IndyCar today. We know it's a mix of tracks, but during this time, I guess it resembled more of a NASCAR kind of approach, all ovals. This ended in Canada on July 3rd, 1977. IndyCar, as we know today, they are continuing to try to grow the sport and say, can we make this international? Can we get the broadcast? Well, for those who say, oh, it can't be done, there might be a reason for it. 1978, IndyCar did try to go to Europe with 2 races, one's at Brands Hatch, one at Silverstone, wasn't successful campaign. And so with that is kind of the idea of IndyCar as an American series, or at least a North American series, racing in the US and Canada. All right, getting into a little bit more of the interesting, I think, bit of the history. The first of it, now this is not the split, that when you hear people talk about IndyCar and the history of this IndyCar, they talk about the split. This isn't it. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you did have the USAC split that did occur. So this came from the formation of the championship auto racing teams, or CART. Remember that name? CART's going to be very important in the history of IndyCar. There was a lot of disputes on what needs to happen in the series, who needs to run it, what's happening with IMS in the 500. So big kind of schism happened where you had people with USAC, you had people going to join CART. But however, in 1979, USAC, due to just not having enough support behind it, was merged into CART, all becoming the championship auto racing teams. All right, so that leads us into the 80s, era 3, also what can really be thought of as the open wheels war. So this lasted for a very long time, from the 80s till 2008. So we're really kind of getting into more recent modern day at this point. Notable names, again, mentioning these as people you are still going to see as part of the IndyCar world. Michael Andretti made his appearance during this time. Rookie season in 1983. He won the 1991 CART Championship, won the Michigan 500 in 1987, 1989. However, he has never won the Indy 500. Another name, our good buddy Bobby Rahal. Bobby Rahal's rookie season was in 1982. And with that, he won 3 championships. The 1986, where he beat Michael in the very last race of the season to win that championship. He also won the 1987 and the 1992 championship. With this, we also saw Nigel Mansell and Emerson Fittipaldi come over from F1 and really kind of make their name into IndyCar. Now the drama. Now what is probably like really realistically, IndyCar does not have a lot of big drama that has occurred over the years. This is it. This is the big kind of shebang. I'm not going to go super in depth. There are other podcasts, and I'm going to promote a friend of mine who has one at the end that does spend a lot more time on it. So there are IndyCar historians who can do a much better job and much better justice to this. But we can't talk about the history of it and not talk about the split of 1996. A lot of tension was happening in 1996. So really what you can think of is what is occurring. So you have CART. They are the one big body that is, in charge of everything. However, the Indy 500 and IMS was not actually a sanctioned event by CART. Everyone, of course, raced in the 500. It was a big deal. 500 still the 500, but it was not ran by the sanctioning body. With this, it was ran by president of IMS, Tony George. Tony didn't particularly like how things were being ran by CART. He didn't like that CART kind of wanted to take over the 500, take over IMS. With this too, you also had in 1992, CART trademarked the name IndyCar. This is kind of notable because then in 1996, Tony George, because of his dissatisfaction, along with other teams and members of this that were unhappy with how CART were running things, he launched what would become known as IRL, or the Indy Racing League. CART ended up suing them for trademark infringement over, who gets the right to the name IndyCar. We're talking about really what happened. The idea with IRL was that it was cheaper than CART racing. So these teams that were part of CART that were deciding to leave were able to do it because it benefited them more to be able to do so. It also was the goal to be able to promote sprint drivers and peak drivers in the kind of midget racing series into the sport. So really kind of the idea of like, well, no, we need to get our feeder series feeding into actually going into IndyCar. It was also oval only. So that was kind of really another thing, a key difference between kart and IRL was really what were they doing? So with IRL having the 500 and everything, they were oval only at this point. The 1996, so right after the split, really kind of took place. The 1996 500 saw that 25 out of the 33 slots were reserved for those IRL teams, really kind of incentivizing, well, this is why you should leave kart and come to us. Kart countered with the US 500 that was held in Michigan on the same day. You saw notable drivers such as Paul Tracy and Michael Andretti and Marco Andretti and Mario Andretti stay with the kart organization. With this, the 2000s brought a lot of change. So 90s still a lot of upheaval, everyone very, very split. Fans very, very split because you're watching two different forms of motorsport that it's the same, same series, but it's not. 2000s kind of brought a lot to the foreground and what would kind of then become more the modern era of the sport. With this, you saw the engine suppliers, Honda and Toyota, both left kart to come to IRL. That's a big thing too, of like, okay, well, if your engine suppliers are going, what are you going to be doing? 2002, following this, Team Penske, Chip Ganassi Racing, Andretti Green Racing, and Team Rahal all decided to go to IRL. So teams that are still all actively involved in the sport decided to go from there. 2003, you saw the kart declare bankruptcy. They were then bought out, same really kind of organization, but they changed names to become the Champ Car World Series, which lasted from 2004 to 2008. So some cars that were part of kart, when they dissolved, ended up going to IRL because of it. The Champ Series, though, did include teams that we do have heard of or have kind of noticeable names in sports. Newman Haas, which is one of the teams that James Hinchcliffe raced for. His first team, they went to Champ Car and then DCR, so Del Coin Racing, still in the sport now. They ended up going to the Champ Car Series as well. So very interesting time, very interesting split. We're still seeing a bunch of teams that are still very active and very big names in the sport kind of deciding where are they falling through these kind of early and mid 2000s. With this, though, eventually it could not last. We just all returned to one series, so 2007. So last year of a split divide between this one. Talk started in 2006, but due to different people kind of leaking information ahead of time, it took a lot longer than it should have for the two series to end up merging together, leading to 2008 IndyCar Series as we know it today to come to be. And that leads us into Era 4, the IndyCar Series. 2008 through 2019, of course, we'd still the IndyCar Series as we know it and love it to this day, but we'll talk about why specifically we were ending in 2019. So 2008, finally one series. We're not competing with different things. Everyone's in one spot. Saw the introduction of the Leader Circle. For those who don't know what the Leader Circle is, this is prize money that the teams can win if they finish above a certain point for the 2025 season. It is going to be the top 25 teams that are competing. The top 22 cars get money from this Leader Circle. Top 25 teams or chartered teams are able to compete for it. If you're interested in any of that part of it and where we are currently with the charter system, we have a whole episode on it. Please go listen to that. 2008 saw Scott Dixon in his 5th season in the series win the championship in the 500. Consisted of 19 races. With this kind of last minute kind of merging that happened, we saw schedules really get revamped from what had been previously published and finally kind of resemble both what we saw in the beginning of IndyCar and those early days and also what we know and love today, in that it wasn't just ovals that like IRL was doing. You were able to see this include ovals, road courses, and street courses for the first time in a very long time. With this too, this led to Tony George being fired as the head of IRL in the Indy 500 because he was so actively involved in this open wheels war and for the fact that the merger was so long in happening and everyone kind of felt this should have happened a lot sooner than it did. A couple things with this era that we saw too. Again, this very much is what we know and love. This is what, at least in my mind, being relatively a year into the sport, what I think of is we are seeing kind of modern racing. 2012, we brought a new chassis. With this, we have 3 engine suppliers in 2012. So we had Honda, Chevy, and Lotus. Lotus was only there for that one season. That saw the introduction of the Dallara Ram chassis, which was nicknamed the DW12. This was nicknamed the DW12 and ran from 2012 to 2014 because of the passing of Dan Weldon in 2011. So that's where that nickname comes from. But it's still, Dallara is still the chassis and everything that is ran today. With this too, 2018, we saw a universal aero kit. brought to the DW12. That's the chassis we know we currently have. We have been running for way too long at this point, but it's just really kind of what introduced IndyCar to being a spec series because everything was a lot more, I guess, commercialized by the teams. Everyone's running the DW12. Everyone's either a Chevy or a Honda engine supplier. The cars kind of returned to the basics of the kart design from the 90s and 2000s. This was able to reduce costs, and with that, though, it did have a reduction in downforce. Drivers still complaining about how this change in chassis really it slowed them down a lot from where they think they should be able to run these cars. We'll see what that comes up to. 2027, we are getting a new chassis, so a couple years away. Renderings are starting to come out now, but not my world to even touch on. All right, modern era IndyCar and why I kind of separated out from 2019 to present day. Era 5, refer to this IndyCar series with Penske Entertainment. 2020, modern day IndyCar, we saw Roger Penske, the owner of Team Penske, as well as the head of Penske Entertainment and his whole crew there. They took over the NTT IndyCar Series, the Indy 500, and running IMS. So this is really kind of the first time kind of in modern history that we are seeing all three of these crucial parts of IndyCar falling under the same umbrella. Whether you love it, whether you hate it, I think it's been a beneficial thing for the sport. Whether a team owner being the one who runs both, up for debate. I don't think I have a strong opinion either way, just up for debate. 2020 also saw the intro of the aero screen. I'm sure Meg will touch on aero screens and all of that when we talk about tech specs and regs, but thank God. That's all I'm going to say is thank God that we have those. And then 2024, so last season, midway through the season, for probably the first time ever, you see something introduced in the middle of a season that's groundbreaking. We saw hybrid engines come to IndyCar. We have done a whole episode on that. Meg has gone in depth again. I'm sure she'll touch on it in specs, techs, and regs. So if you don't know what a hybrid engine is or what that means, we'll gear you up for that as well. That concludes my PowerPoint. Questions, comments, concerns?
Phenomenal PowerPoint, by the way. Absolutely loved it. We are 1000% publishing that. No, that was really well done. That was a lot of information, and I did not realize there was so much lore that went on in like the 80s and 90s.
Like I said, there's a lot of people who have done a lot more in-depth stuff on it. There's actually a couple really interesting YouTube videos that really discuss all of it a lot more in depth, but we are not a history podcast, so that's just kind of a brief overview on kind of, what is our sport? Where did we come from to get to today?
Yeah, it's all important information to know. Like there are so many things that are just like casually mentioned throughout the season in like the commentators box and like just interviews and stuff, like it's good to know the history of it. And especially when it comes to like the 500, we know it's the biggest spectacle in motorsport. It is the biggest deal. It is part of the Triple Crown. We know it, we love it, but like for so long, I was just like, why is it such a big deal? It's just an oval course. It's just an oval race. But knowing the history behind it makes it important.
And speaking of the 500 specifically, like I said, I'm going to plug another podcast here. It's called Goes to the Brickyard, where they really go through kind of every single Indy 500. They discuss the winners and everything that kind of happened in the race for the last 100 and plus years. So if you're really interested in that, again, it's Goes to the Brickyard. Go check it out. Go support them. Yeah.
Love that. 10 out of 10. Good job.
I think that concludes our history episode. As always, check us out on socials, Racing Thoughts Podcast, Instagram, and TikTok. I think that's it. Next we'll be discussing tech specs, regs, everything you need to know. It's great to know the history, but what about the cars? What about the tires? More importantly, what about the liveries?
Listen, there's a lot to go into. And if you are interested in learning about what the cars are actually made of and, what purpose each thing serves and also the rules and regulations behind stuff as you watch the race, because that is a huge learning curve if you are either a brand new fan or you're coming from, another series, or even if you're just like, I don't know half the rules. So it's always good to know. So that's what I'm going to be talking about in our next episode. So if you're interested, I'll see you over there, guys.
All right. Bye, y'all.
Bye.